Before the sun rose over Caracas on January 3, 2026, a foreign military force was already inside Venezuela. What followed in the next 30 minutes would shock the world. But what if the most important part of this story did not happen in Venezuela at all? What if it was written years earlier in a 900-page document that the man who ordered the operation publicly claimed to know nothing about? To understand how the United States arrived at the threshold of a sovereign nation's capital in the dead of night, you have to understand the architecture of intention that preceded it. Policy does not emerge from nothing. Military operations of this scale do not unfold spontaneously. They are planned, drafted, argued over, and ultimately authorized through chains of decision-making that stretch back further than any single news cycle. The story of what happened in Venezuela on January 3, 2026, is at its core a story about a roadmap, and the question we are going to examine carefully and factually is how closely that roadmap was followed. The document at the center of this story is called Project 2025, formerly titled Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise. It was published in April 2023 by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank based in Washington, D.C. The document runs to approximately 900 pages. It was compiled by contributions from more than 400 individuals, many of whom had served in government positions during Donald Trump's first administration, and many of whom would go on to serve in his second. Its stated purpose was to provide a comprehensive policy framework for a conservative administration taking office in January 2025. The Heritage Foundation has been producing versions of Mandate for Leadership since 1981, when Ronald Reagan used the first edition as a governing guide. What distinguished the 2023 version was its scale, its specificity, and its personnel component. The project spent an estimated $22 million preparing staffing recommendations, operating on the Reagan-era maxim that personnel is policy. It was, in the assessment of those who built it, not merely a wish list. It was a blueprint. During the 2024 presidential campaign, Donald Trump publicly distanced himself from the document. He told reporters he had no idea who was behind it and that some of its suggestions were absolutely ridiculous. Those statements are on record. What is also on record is what happened after he won. Within 4 days of his second inauguration, an analysis by Time magazine found that nearly 2/3 of his executive actions mirrored or partially mirrored proposals from Project 2025. Paul Dans, who directed the project before departing to support Trump's campaign, told the BBC that the plan was conservative gospel right now. He said with evident satisfaction that if it were not for President Trump, it would just be a report on a shelf. But what did that report say about Venezuela specifically, and how do those words connect to what unfolded on January 3, 2026? That is the thread we are going to follow, and it leads somewhere that requires careful, precise examination because the connections are real, they are documented, and they are also more nuanced than either the most alarmed or the most dismissive readings suggest. Project 2025 mentions Venezuela at least 6 times. In its foreign policy sections, the document identifies 5 countries as requiring the incoming administration's heightened attention. The 5 are China, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and North Korea. The language used to describe Venezuela is explicit. The document calls the Maduro government a left-wing authoritarian kleptocracy. It states that to contain Venezuela's communism and aid international partners, the next administration must take important steps to put Venezuela's communist abusers on notice. It warns that Venezuela's communist leadership has drawn closer to some of the United States' greatest international foes, naming China and Iran as having sought a foothold in the Americas. And it frames Venezuela as a country where collapsed governance had enabled drug trafficking and foreign influence. That framing matters. It matters because it established Venezuela not as a peripheral concern, but as a central strategic priority. It matters because the language of narco-terrorism, of communist kleptocracy, of abusers requiring notice, is the same language Secretary of State Marco Rubio used in the weeks and months before the January 3rd operation. And it matters because, as we will examine, the legal and operational scaffolding erected in 2025 tracked the document's priorities with a consistency that was not coincidental. But there is an important distinction that Snopes and other fact-checking organizations have verified, and it is a distinction that journalistic honesty requires us to state clearly. Project 2025 did not call for unilateral military action in Venezuela. Its Western Hemisphere section used the phrase re-hemisphering of Latin America, but as Snopes confirmed after reviewing the actual text, that phrase appeared in an economic context, focused on moving manufacturing and industry closer to home. The security subsection that followed proposed military and other collaborations with allies in and outside Latin America, not unilateral operations. In other words, the Trump administration's military operation in Venezuela went a step beyond what the document itself proposed. Acknowledging that distinction is not a minor footnote. It is essential to an accurate account. So if the document provided the destination but not the specific route, how did the administration get from one to the other? The answer runs through an escalating sequence of legal designations, military build-ups, and intelligence operations, each step building the foundation for the next, and each step traceable, at least in part, to the policy priorities Project 2025 articulated in 2023. The escalation did not begin in January 2026. It began by the documented record in the earliest weeks of the second Trump administration. In February 2025, Secretary of State Marco Rubio designated Tren de Aragua, a Venezuela origin gang that had spread across Latin America and into the United States, as a foreign terrorist organization. That designation was significant not merely symbolically. Under existing law, it enabled new sanctions, new law enforcement authorities, and new immigration actions against the group and its members. In the same month, the administration invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, an 18th-century wartime statute, to enable the rapid deportation of individuals it alleged were Tren de Aragua members. More than 200 people were subsequently sent to a maximum security prison in El Salvador. That invocation of the Alien Enemies Act became one of the most legally contested actions of the administration's early months. Critics argued it violated the due process rights of the people being deported. Courts agreed, at least in part. In September 2025, a federal appeals court ruled that the Trump administration could not use the Alien Enemies Act to deport suspected Tren de Aragua members, finding that the gang's presence did not constitute an invasion in the legal sense the statute requires. The court noted that the mass migration of Venezuelan immigrants did not constitute an armed or organized force. And critically, the court's ruling referenced an April 2025 National Intelligence Council assessment that directly contradicted a central premise of the administration's legal argument. That assessment stated that while Venezuela's permissive environment enables Tren de Aragua to operate, the Maduro regime probably does not have a policy of cooperating with the gang and is not directing its movement to and operations in the United States. That intelligence finding, produced by the administration's own intelligence community, was at odds with the public justifications the administration had offered for some of its most aggressive actions. But what continued unimpeded, and what accelerated through the summer and autumn of 2025, was the military build-up in the Caribbean. In August 2025, the United States began positioning warships, fighter jets, and armed forces personnel in the southern Caribbean. The operation was named Operation Southern Spear, and the administration publicly described its aim as targeting drug trafficking. The United States' most advanced aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, was deployed to the region. Between September and December 2025, the U.S. military carried out at least 35 known strikes against boats in the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean that it claimed were transporting drugs principally from Venezuela. Those strikes killed at least 115 people, according to reporting by the Associated Press. In October 2025, President Trump publicly authorized the CIA to operate inside Venezuela. According to subsequent reporting by NBC News and CNN, a small CIA unit had quietly entered Venezuela as early as August with the goal of providing, in the words of one source with knowledge of the matter, extraordinary insight into Maduro's movements. The CIA team tracked where he slept, what he ate, where he traveled. Even his pets were known to U.S. intelligence agents, according to Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane, speaking at a press conference after the operation. Elite troops trained for months using a replica of the presidential compound constructed from that intelligence. All of this, the legal designations, the military build-up, the CIA deployment, the maritime strikes, constituted an escalating pressure campaign whose endpoint, by late 2025, was becoming increasingly apparent to those watching it. And it had been anticipated, in broad if not operational terms, by the policy framework that Project 2025 laid out. The document's language about putting Venezuela's abusers on notice was not passive, it was directional. What the administration built in 2025 was the infrastructure of enforcement. The congressional dimension of this story is one that received less public attention than it deserved. On December 17, 2025, Congress voted on a resolution that would have required the administration to seek congressional authorization before engaging in hostilities against Venezuela. The resolution failed by 2 votes. Under the United States Constitution, Congress holds the sole power to declare war. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 requires the President to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to a foreign conflict and limits unauthorized military engagement to 60 days. The administration's legal justification for the Venezuela operation was that it constituted a law enforcement action with military support, not an act of war. President Trump cited what he described as inherent constitutional authority to undertake the operation. Legal scholars responded with skepticism. Jeffrey Robertson, a human rights lawyer, stated the strike was contrary to Article 2 of the UN Charter and qualifies as a crime of aggression under international law. Several Democratic members of Congress accused Secretaries Rubio and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth of misrepresenting their intentions during a Senate briefing. Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey wrote publicly that Rubio and Hegseth had looked every senator in the eye a few weeks ago and said this was not about regime change. He concluded they had lied to Congress. There is an irony embedded in this legal dispute that one letter to a main newspaper captured precisely. A reader writing in December 2025 quoted Project 2025 itself on the question of war powers. On page 88 of the document it states, "We must rediscover and adhere to the founders' wise division of war powers, whereby Congress, the most representative and deliberative branch, decides whether to go to war, and the executive, the most energetic and decisive branch, decides how to carry it out once begun." The reader concluded that Congress, by failing to block the administration and by having apparently not read this passage, had removed itself from its constitutional role. That observation, grounded in the actual text of the document, adds a dimension of internal contradiction to the story that should not be overlooked. Shortly after midnight on January 3, 2026, President Trump gave the final order. At approximately 2 a.m. local time in Caracas, explosions were observed across northern Venezuela as U.S. forces suppressed air defenses. Special Operations Forces moved to Fuerte Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex. Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, were taken from their compound after both attempted to reach a safe room, according to Trump's account. The operation lasted less than 30 minutes on the ground. 7 U.S. service members were injured. Venezuelan authorities subsequently confirmed that a large part of Maduro's security team were killed. Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello stated that more than 100 people were killed in total during the operation. Cuba's presidential office announced that 32 Cuban military and intelligence personnel were killed while carrying out missions for their Venezuelan counterparts. Maduro and his wife were transported to the USS Iwo Jima and subsequently taken to New York. They appeared in Manhattan Federal Court on January 5th, where they pleaded not guilty to charges of narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and weapons offenses. U.S. District Judge Alvin Hellerstein ordered Maduro held until at least a March 17th hearing. Standing before cameras at Mar-a-Lago, President Trump described the operation as amazing. He spoke openly about American companies rebuilding Venezuela's oil industry. He stated that the United States would run the country until a proper transition could take place. Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as interim president on January 5th. The Venezuelan state remained intact around her. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez retained command of the military. Trump described Rodriguez as essentially willing to do what the administration thought necessary. On January 6th, Trump stated that Venezuelan officials would turn over approximately $3 billion in sanctioned oil. According to U.S. officials, the broader energy deal envisioned that the United States would market and sell Venezuelan oil, depositing proceeds into U.S.-controlled accounts with stated benefits for both the American and Venezuelan peoples. Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who had escaped Venezuela in December 2025 to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, held a press conference at the Heritage Foundation after meeting Trump at the White House. She said the result of a stable transition would be a Venezuela that was profoundly pro-American and the best ally the United States had ever had in the Americas. That press conference location, the Heritage Foundation, was not without symbolism. The institution that had published the roadmap was now hosting the person the administration appeared to be positioning as a central figure in Venezuela's political future. The circle, at least in terms of institutional relationships, was visible. What remained unclear, and what analysts from the Congressional Research Service and elsewhere were careful to flag, was whether the path from that vision to a stable, democratic Venezuela was as clear as the operation that removed Maduro had been. The geopolitical consequences of the Venezuela operation spread quickly and unevenly. The international reaction, as documented by the UN, the regional press, and multiple governments, was predominantly one of condemnation, including from nations that had themselves refused to recognize Maduro's legitimacy. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Spain, and Uruguay issued a joint statement on January 4th, expressing profound concern and firm rejection of the military actions. The UN Secretary-General stated that US actions constituted a dangerous precedent and that the rules of international law had not been respected. China and Russia called for Maduro's immediate release. The UN Security Council convened on January 5th at the request of China, Colombia, and Russia. A Reuters and Ipsos poll taken on January 4th and 5th found Americans themselves divided, 33% approving, 34% disapproving, and 33% uncertain. But returning to the thread with which we began, Project 2025 and its relationship to these events. The analysis available from multiple credible sources points toward a layered, honest answer. The document named Venezuela as a priority. It described the Maduro government in terms that foreshadowed the legal framings later used to justify military action. Many of the individuals who wrote it went on to serve in the administration that carried out that action. The Heritage Foundation's Paul Dans told the BBC that around half of Project 2025's policies had been implemented within the first year. A BBC and broader media analysis found deep connections between the document's authors and the administration's decisions. But the operation itself went further than the document prescribed. Snopes verified that Project 2025's specific language on Latin America did not call for unilateral military force. The gap between what the document proposed and what the administration did is real and documented. That gap does not dissolve the connections. It contextualizes them. What Project 2025 provided, as geopolitical strategist Matt Gertken told Newsweek, was a reflection of the administration's intentions, not a precise operational script. The administration's national security strategy, released in December 2025, gave more specific detail about Washington's focus on the Western Hemisphere and its goal of reasserting what Trump and others called the Monroe Doctrine. What that means, stated plainly, is this: Project 2025 established Venezuela as a target. The administration built the legal, military, and intelligence infrastructure to act on that designation over the course of 2025. And when the moment came, in the early hours of January 3, 2026, it acted. Whether one regards the result as a law enforcement success, an act of aggression, or something in between depends on legal and moral frameworks that courts, historians, and citizens are now actively debating. What is not in debate is the sequence. The policy came first, the infrastructure followed, and then the operation. The story of Project 2025 and Venezuela is ultimately a story about the distance between words on a page and actions in the world, and about who travels that distance and why. It is a story about how policy documents dismissed as theoretical during an election campaign became operational frameworks inside a government. And it is a story about accountability, about whether the people who wrote those frameworks, the administration that implemented them, and the Congress that twice failed to assert its constitutional role in authorizing military force, can be held to account for what followed. The facts are on the record, the connections are documented, the legal questions are before the courts, the political questions are before the public. What this reporting can offer is the chronology, the sourcing, and the honest acknowledgement of what is confirmed, what is contested, and what remains to be resolved. The operation in Venezuela was not an improvisation. It was the product of a system that had been built, piece by piece, over years. And the blueprint for that system was available in a public document, published in April 2023, that anyone could read. The question of whether enough people did and whether they acted on what they found is one that the months ahead will force us all to answer.